All right. Well, while we're talking about people passing away and that kind of thing, uh, unfortunately, too many of them pass away because of murders or unjust killings, that kind of thing. And so, the Bible has a partial solution for that, which is the death penalty. And there are not many countries that really, in fact, I'm not aware. Maybe Singapore, I'm aware of, that uses the death penalty in a way that's closer to the way it's spoken of in the Bible. But it's one of the things that we should know about and begin to pray. It'd be nice if our society would move in the right direction because, the world is a dangerous place. It's a very dangerous place. And the Bible has guidelines and directions that would help it be less dangerous, but it requires real conviction to do what God says to do. A lot of times we think, oh, God tells me to do stuff and I just do it. When it comes to the death penalty, it's very difficult to carry through with what God says. And that's one of the reasons that you look at the countries of the world. And like I say, I don't really know of any country, and what I know about Singapore might be pretty close, that it actually does what the Bible says to do, although I can't speak for all the laws in Singapore. But anyway, so we're going to talk about the death penalty tonight. And the first thing I want to say is that people think that the death penalty is against life. Actually, the death penalty affirms the value of life. Because without the death penalty, you're saying that what your life is worth, what my life is worth, is, if somebody spends 10 or 15 years in jail or something like that, or if they're a little bit mentally compromised, if they spend no time in jail, that's what my life is worth. It's worth the person who kills me just saying, wow, I'm really not mentally stable. I was in a bad place. Sorry about that. And God doesn't go with that. God doesn't buy that. There's when you study the death penalty in the Bible, there's nothing that says, well, there's a category of there's a category of penalties for people that are emotionally upset, or they weren't trained right, or they were raised in a poor family, and so they have a separate category. God treats everybody equally. And the death penalty really affirms the value of life because it stands forth and it says the only thing that's valuable enough to pay for a human life is a human life. And so it actually affirms the value of life. Now, uh, in the Christian world, I would say in the Christian world, the majority of people that I have spoken to in my life about the death penalty think that the death penalty is wrong. And the primary reason is some of the major translations and the way they translate it. Exodus chapter 20, where it talks about the sixth commandment. So let's just go there. It's Exodus chapter 20, 13. And thankfully, excuse me, thankfully, the modern versions, the really modern versions are getting on top of this. But your King James version says, thou shalt not kill. And most people just take that at straight value. They don't understand biblical research. They don't understand context and how you modify a translation depending on the context. And they say the Bible says not to kill, and the death penalty is killing, and therefore the death penalty is wrong. And that's first of all, if that shows one thing, it shows that we've got to be better students of the Bible in that. And it also shows the power of mistranslation. Now, in 1611, when the King James was translated, somehow or other, they had executions, lots of executions. I mean, they had hangings and executions by firing squad and that kind of thing. Somehow or other, in those early years, the 1600s, the 1700s, the translation in the King James Version or the Geneva Bible, thou shalt not kill, everybody understood that it was talking about unjust killing, not executing criminals. But as the world has become more modern and sensibilities have changed, um, all of a sudden, here's the King James Version, and now what wasn't a mistranslation in 1611 because of the understanding of the culture becomes a mistranslation in 2025 because people take it for just face value. Thou shalt not kill. There you go. We're done here. There's no death penalty. And that's Exodus chapter 20, which is when God gave the Ten Commandments, by the way. And I'm sure many of you remember this. The Ten Commandments were given by God at the beginning of the wilderness wanderings, and then they were repeated at the end of the wilderness wanderings 40 years later. And remember that the generation that came out of Egypt died off in the wilderness. So God had a need to re-speak a lot of the truths that he spoke early on. Exodus occurred in the first couple months of the wilderness wanderings. And so it's been a full 40 years before we get to Deuteronomy. And so you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, where we have a repeat of the Ten Commandments. And in verse 17, you have the same commandment, the sixth commandment, do not murder. And thankfully, even versions that you might not expect would change. For example, the New King James Version says, you shall not murder. The Revised English Bible, do not commit murder. The New International Version, the NIV, you shall not murder. The New American Standard Bible, you shall not murder. The New Revised Standard Version, you shall not murder. The Amplified Version, you shall not commit murder. And so it goes. Modern versions translate the Hebrew word rasak, which has quite a wide semantic range and can refer to killing in general or murder or judicial execution, and they translate it, you shall not murder. And one of the things that comes up when we study the death penalty is that it's a fundamental underpinning of a just society. If you're going to have a safe and just society, and by just I mean a society that affirms the value of life, if you're going to have that kind of society, the death penalty is one of the underpinnings for various reasons. And therefore, it's mentioned in all 5 books of Moses. And unless you read those and are paying attention, you don't really get that. But it's mentioned in Genesis, mentioned in Exodus, mentioned in Leviticus, mentioned in Numbers, mentioned in Deuteronomy. All 5 of the books of Moses, which were, of course, the Torah, which is the instruction upon which you're supposed to base your society. All 5 of those have the command for the death penalty. So let's start in Genesis itself, and we're going to go to Genesis chapter 9. And in Genesis chapter 9, God is speaking to Noah after Noah gets off the boat. And so in Genesis chapter 9, God is speaking, like I say, of things that are going to be different. Verse 1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Well, that makes good sense because when they got off the boat, there was only 8 of them. It's like, guys, there's not enough of you people. We need more people to fill the earth. So that makes perfect sense, which, by the way, is one of the things that we notice about the Bible when we have a good translation, and that is that it makes good sense. If we look at the Bible and if we don't understand something, or if it kind of rubs us in a funny way, if we start looking and say, okay, this is God's word, how does it make sense? And sometimes there are mistranslations that don't make any sense, and that's one of the reasons that we at Spirit and Truth work so hard to get a translation that does make sense. Then in verse 2, the fear of you and the dread of you will come upon every animal of the earth, because up until this time, the animals all ate plants, and people were supposed to eat plants as well. And so the animals weren't afraid of people because we weren't eating them. But now in Genesis 9, after the flood, humankind is going to start to eat animals. Verse 3 makes that clear. Every moving thing that lives will be food for you, as with the green plants, which were your food up until now, I have now given everything to you. Verse 4, but flesh with its life, its blood, you are not to eat. Now then, verse 5, surely I will require a reckoning for your lifeblood. From the hand of every animal I will require it, and from the hand of every man. In other words, God is going to pay attention to who's killing what. From the hand of a brother human, I will require a reckoning for the life of a human. Verse 6, this becomes important then. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood is to be shed, for God made man in his own image. And that's an interesting teaching we could add in here too. We're not going to take time for it tonight, that God, man is in God's image. This is Moses. I mean, this is Noah getting off the ark with Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives. And they don't have spirit at this time. They didn't have Holy Spirit in them. Maybe Noah had spirit on him, but man is still in the image of God, even without spirit. And that's why we know that the image of God has to do with how our minds work, our desire for community, our desire for a family, our desire to have meaning, our desire to create. All those things are part of the image of God. But verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood is to be shed. And this is God giving the responsibility of running a society to people. And this becomes really important. You know, I was involved twice in my life. I've been involved in the prison system. I was involved one time in a light prison. One of the, basically they had a chain link fence and people were only in for a couple months or maybe just up to a few years. And so basically nobody ran off, and I got involved in that prison ministry. But then I was also involved in a prison ministry for about a year and a half or so in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I ran a fellowship in the Raleigh Federal Penitentiary for women. And, so I have had some very personal exposure to the prisons and that kind of thing and what goes on in them. Plus, my ex-wife was a nurse in a prison system. And so she was exposed to a lot of stuff, and we would talk about that. And so one of the things that comes up when you're talking to people is they just say, I just believe if somebody's worthy of death, that God's going to put him to death. And this is where, guys, what we believe has to line up with the Word of God. It sounds really nice to say, I just don't feel like it's my job to judge somebody and decide whether they die or not. I really think that's God's job. Well, you can really think that, but God says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood is to be shed. So God gave us the responsibility to run our society. And if we don't do it, it's on us. If our society is full of murderers, if it's full of kidnappers, if it's full of rapists, if we have dangerous animals, dogs and whatever running around, and we don't do anything about them, it's our fault. And we need to educate Christians and hopefully educate societies to wake up and be willing to take, the bull by the horns and say, yes, I'm responsible for this. God is not going to do it. And then we've got to enact laws that are just for humankind. And God gives us some great ideas in that. So let's go to Exodus chapter 21. And in Exodus chapter 21, verse 12, we have a number of things about the death penalty. And we'll be back here in this section again, but I just wanted to read verses 12 to 14 to because we're going to start with murder. When we look at the Old Testament, we're going to cover a couple different actions that God says should require the death penalty. And in verse 12 of Exodus 21, it says, anyone who strikes a person so that he dies must be put to death. Yes, death. And God does the same thing here that he did in the Garden of Eden when he said to Adam, in the day you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. Yes, die. And God repeated the word twice for emphasis. And he does the same thing here. He wants to make sure that, if you're reading the Hebrew text, he wants to make sure that you get this. So he takes the word death and he repeats it twice in two different parts of speech. So anyone who strikes a person so that he dies must be put to death. Yes, death. And notice he must be put to death. God doesn't say the person who strikes someone so that he dies, I will kill. God has handed this to humankind. He's handed it to us. He's not going to take it back. He says that he must be put to death. Verse 13, we know that a lot of people get into a situation where there's an accidental death. God, of course, understands that and covers it. Verse 13, but if it was not premeditated, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he can flee. That was called the city of refuge. There were a number of cities of refuge in Israel so people could get to one quickly, so they could be saved from the avenger of blood. And it's in the book of Numbers that God spends quite a bit of time covering the cities of refuge, what they are, where they are. They ended up being on both sides of the Jordan and from north to south in Israel. So, like I say, somebody could get there very quickly. Verse 14 then goes, if a man maliciously schemes against his neighbor to kill him, you must take him from my altar to be put to death. And that's much stronger in the biblical culture than if we just think about it. For those of you that know movies like The Hunchback of Notre Dame and that kind of thing, in the Western culture, it was believed that if a criminal could get to a church and would be willing to be in that church, that he could have sanctuary. Well, that's kind of a bleed over from the Old Testament, where if a man could get to the tabernacle or later on to the temple and hold on to the altar, that was a place of sanctuary until he could get a trial or could be given an escort to a city of refuge. Now, it does say later on that if he's actually guilty of murder, then you can take him from the altar and execute him. But a lot of times, if something happened and you needed to be able to get to a refuge very quickly, and that refuge was the altar. And so the Bible is saying here, if a man maliciously schemes against a neighbor to kill him, even if he gets to the altar, he doesn't get any sanctuary. You take him from the altar and put him to death. So this is how God feels. And again, when it says he must be put to death, that's humankind taking the responsibility. Let's go to 21. We're here in Exodus 21, drop down to verse 23. And this was an eye-opener for me. When I first began, I was raised atheist. You guys all know the story of that. So I didn't have a Bible, never went to church, anything like that. But through my life, just because my dad was educated and my mom was educated, I'd heard the saying, an eye for an eye. And I was, okay, yeah, an eye for an eye. I still can sort of remember what happened in my head when I really read what Exodus said about that, because this is talking about death after a fight, verse 22 and verse 23. But if any harm results, then you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So this is the equality that you could demand under the law. And he starts out by saying, that you are to take life for life. He doesn't say, I will take. He says, you are to take. And I want to put pressure on that because, like I say, it's taking somebody's life is not easy, even if you know that they really deserve it and they're really an evil person and they're really harmful in society. It's still not easy to take a life. And so God says, you are to take a life for life, and people need to step up to the plate. Now, this sounds really horrible, but in fact, actually, if you understand the culture of the ancient Near East, this was a protectant. because in a lot of the cultures of the ancient Near East, because of the division of the classes, there was the king and then all of his court and all of his family. And then you had the noble class, if you will, the wealthy people, the powerful people. And then you had the poorer people. And then, you had slaves. And in a lot of the laws, like the Babylonian law code, the Assyrian law code, and those kind of codes, that if you as a lesser member of society hurt a higher member of society, a wealthier person, that kind of thing, then the punishment was not equal. Like if they hurt you, basically they get away with it, but if you hurt them, then you lose a hand, or you get blinded, or they cut off your ears, or cut out your tongue, or just kill you, or whatever. And so God here is putting an end to that. He's saying, I don't care if you're the king or the poorest person on the street. If harm results, there's an equality to what can be meted out in the way of so-called justice. And so it's interesting that when you first read this sounds very harsh, but actually it's actually protecting people in society. And then you learn that with rare exception, the families could negotiate this down if they wanted to. Like if two guys just got in a really, really bad argument and one guy punched another in the face and he lost a tooth, that yes, the family could press the law and say, we get to knock out one of your teeth. But generally speaking, they could work out something where there's a gift of cows or money or land or whatever. And you didn't see the fullness of this come out. In the way that justice was really met. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 21. I want to keep pushing the fact that the death penalty is definitely a part of the Old Testament. Now we're in Deuteronomy, so we read about the death penalty in Genesis. We read about the death penalty in Exodus. Here we are in the book of Deuteronomy. And in verse 21, well, we're gonna be back here a little later in the teaching, but in verse 21 it says, "Your eye must not pity." This is, making sure there's justice. Your eye must not pity. There is to be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And again, he starts with life for life because that's so important. Now let's go to Leviticus. So we've seen Genesis, we've seen Exodus. Let's go to Leviticus. And in Leviticus, in chapter 24, and we're going to go to verse 17, and this becomes really important. Verse 17, "And if a man takes the life of any human being, he must be put to death." Yes, death. We have the same figure that we had in Exodus chapter 21. But now watch the next verse. "He who takes the life of an animal is to make restitution for it, life for life." Oh, wait a minute. If you take the life of a human being, you're put to death. But if you take the life of an animal, you make restitution for it, life for life. And what does that mean? It means that if you kill somebody's cow, then you have to pay that with a cow of your own. Well, in fact, we can just read this and we'll read it through verse 19. "If anyone injures his fellow Israelite," and that's what fellow would mean here, Israelites in italics, it's added. "If anyone injures his fellow Israelite, as he has done, so it is to be done to him." This is just basically exactly what we read in Exodus and Deuteronomy. "Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has injured someone, so it is to be done to him." And by the way, this cuts down on a lot of accidents. There's a lot of carelessness that happens in the world because there's really historically not been a lot of retribution for carelessness. And the result of that is that people, they're careless. They don't care because if somebody else gets hurt, oh well. But if you're following the Old Testament law and you don't want to get hurt, then you make sure that the way you live, other people don't get hurt either. And that's important. So then in verse 21, he who kills an animal is to make restitution, but he who kills a human is to be put to death. Verse 22, you're to have one kind of law for the sojourner as well as the native born. Somebody visiting Israel has under the same law as somebody who's native born, because I am Yahweh your God. There's only one God, Yahweh. And so this this is here for, like I say, guidance. And one of the things we learn from this then is that animals are not equal to people. I know there's a lot of animal lovers out there, and I appreciate the fact that you love an animal, but an animal is not the same as a human being. And when it says that if you take the life of an animal, you make restitution for it, it means if you kill somebody's cow, then you show up with a cow. And it's interesting how this works. There was I have a friend who doesn't need to be mentioned, but he was deer hunting in New York State, and he got a deer. Good for him. God bless. Venison is a good meat. And in any case, so he goes to the check station. Well, there was a guy there out in New York City who'd, been raised in the city, lived in the city all his life, thought it'd be a good idea to go deer hunting, and had really very little idea what a deer was. And so he'd shot somebody's donkey, and he had it gutted out and tied to the top of his car. And no kidding, this is a true story. And he gets to the check station, and he's just proud as a peacock. And the police are kind of like, what do we do with this? You shot somebody's donkey. So he had to, they said, okay, you got to take us to where you shot it. And they had to go find the farmer. And sure enough, he had to make restitution to pay for the donkey. He couldn't just say, well, it's an accident. I'm sorry I shot your donkey. But anyway, he did have to make restitution and come up. And I think in his case, it was a financial restitution. He didn't have to go to an auction and buy a donkey or anything. He made a financial restitution. But the point is that had he shot a human being, then, and on purpose, if you murdered somebody, then you don't get to make restitution. And that becomes pretty clear. So let's go to Numbers. So we've now been in Genesis, we've been in Exodus, we've been in Leviticus, we've been in Deuteronomy. Let's go to Numbers. So in Numbers, chapter 35, and there's a lot in Numbers. Numbers is very rich on this subject, and there's a lot in Numbers that we could learn from, and we don't have the time in just one teaching to go through all of the cool stuff in the book of Numbers, but it's really worth following. So Numbers chapter 35, verse 16, and I talked to you about the city of refuge, and that starts in verse 9. And if you see the subtitle there, if you're reading the REV, Cities of Refuge, verse 11 says you're to appoint for yourself cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intending to may flee there. And he talks about, how that's going to work. The verse 16 then changes and says, but if he struck him with an instrument of iron so that he died, he's a murderer. If you pick up an iron tool and hit somebody with it, it was just in the heat of passion. I'm sorry, you're a murderer. And God says, you can't be trusted to be around other human beings. You picked up an instrument of iron, you hit somebody, now he's dead, you're a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. Yes, death. Verse 17, if you struck him with a stone in the hand by which a man could die, and he died, he's a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. Yes, put to death. Verse 18, or if he struck him with a weapon of wood in his hand by which a man could die, and he died, he's a murderer, and the murderer must be put to death. Yes, put to death. The avenger of blood is himself to put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he is to put him to death. And then you can follow that and read the difference. And God outlines very carefully the difference between murder and killing accidentally, and God is very aware that accidents happen. And so you get this kind of thing in the book of Numbers. And then I like verse 31. In verse 31, if our society would pay attention to this one verse, we could turn a lot around. Because in verse 31 it says, you are to accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death. He must be put to death. Yes, put to death. And I don't know how it works in other countries completely, but I know in the United States, you get these killers and they kill somebody, and then when they're talking, when they and their attorney are talking to the DA, then the defending attorney says, well, my client here knows a lot of dirt on a lot of people and could help you in your quest to get the lawbreakers out of your city, blah 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 blah. So if you cut him a deal, he'll give you the names and information you need to prosecute these other guys. And there's a lot of killers who go free because they live and work in a society of killers and they know dirt on other people. And so they're willing to give that up to save their life or save themselves jail time or whatever. And the fact of the matter is, the reason those people are sent out, whoever it is that sends people out, takes out a contract or whatever you want to call it, and they take out a contract on somebody, and you have people that are willing to fulfill those contracts. Why? Because they know that in the end, they're going to be able to bargain their way out of the death penalty. And if the United States government simply said, look, if we get to the point where through witnesses and DNA evidence or whatever it happens to be, if reading your emails, whatever, if we get to the point that we know that you are the one who did the killing, we will execute you. We don't care who you know, what you know. We're not bargaining. It's real simple. You killed somebody, you're guilty, we're putting you to death. And if the United States government would do that, then all of a sudden, when the mafia was looking around for people, or whoever they are, that's looking around for people that fulfill a contract, they'd find out nobody's willing to go out there and kill, to get money from somebody else. Because they know if they're caught, which there's a pretty good likelihood they would be, and especially in today's world when there's a camera on every street corner type of thing, that they're going to be put to death, period. Nobody cares about the information they have, the people they know, or whatever. It's real simple. We have the evidence that you killed, we're executing you. And if we would just do that, which the Bible says, then that would be great. And now I don't even remember if we read the verse or not, but it's in Numbers chapter 35, verse 31. Yeah, you are to accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who's guilty of death. He must be put to death. Yes, put to death. And we need to do that. One more, Deuteronomy chapter 19. And again, going back to some of these other places, just because to show you that this was really a big point. Verse 11, Deuteronomy 19. But if any man hates his neighbor and lies in wait for him and rises up against him and strikes his life so that he dies, then he flees into one of these cities, then the elders of the city are to send and have him taken from there and are to give him over to the hand of the avenger of blood so he dies. Verse 13, your eye must not pity him. And that's where, again, even killing, even executing a somebody we know is genuinely evil, it's never easy to take a life, and God made it that way. I mean, this is serious business. This is how you run a society. Your eye must not pity him, but you must eliminate the shedding of innocent blood from Israel so that it will go well with you. And that's go well spiritually, because a lot of people who kill toy with killing in their mind for a long time. And eventually and sometimes it can come through imagineering, sometimes it can come through video games, sometimes it come from an unwillingness to forgive and just an increased bitterness and hatred, but you pick up a spirit of murder. And there is a spirit of murder in the world. And when you pick up a spirit of murder, then you're going to go out and commit murder. Well, if you take the person who's, it's been months now, sometimes years, they've been building up, they've opened up their mind, they've got a demon of murder, and now you execute that person, and people realize, it, it's not so fun to fantasize about committing murder and killing this guy that I don't like, because I know that if I do, I'm going to be executed. Let me find something else to think about. And people put more pressure on themselves because they don't want to die. So they think, like Philippians says, you think about things that are good and positive and that kind of thing. So that's important. And this guy is just to die. Then the next question people say, well, but I really think maybe, what about the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill? I'm not sure that is a mistranslation. Well, then we go into the Bible and we look at some of the great men and we say, okay, how did they feel about it? For example, Moses was the one that wrote it down. He was the one that wrote the thing, or well, he didn't write it on stone. He carved it out the stone, and at least the second one, and God wrote on it. But anyway, it was Moses who got that command, to not to commit murder. Did Moses kill anybody? Did Moses actually execute any criminals? Yeah, he executed two. In Leviticus 24, verses 10 to 13, he stoned a blasphemer, had a blasphemer, stoned to death. And in Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36, he had a man executed for violating the Sabbath. Well, what about Joshua? Well, there was a man named Achan that by his greed, he caused the death of 36 people. 36 innocent men died because of Achan's greediness. What did they do with Achan? Joshua had him stoned to death in Joshua chapter 7, verse 16. What about Samuel? He was a godly prophet. Did he execute anybody? Yeah. And he executed Agag, the king of the Amalekites. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 33 says he hacked him to death with a sword. David, did David actually go out and execute anybody? We know David fought a lot of wars, but did he actually execute anybody, any criminals? And the answer is yeah. The men who assassinated his rival Ishbosheth, Saul's son, he had the two of them executed. That's 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 12. What about Solomon? We know, Solomon was supposedly a man of peace. Did he actually execute anybody? And the answer is yeah. First of all, he executed his brother Adonijah for fomenting a revolution against him. He executed Joab. He executed Shimei. And that's all in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 13 to 46. So the fact of the matter is that these great men understood that the commandment was not, you shall not kill, but it was, you shall not murder. Want to handle a couple other things too. It wasn't just murder that took a death penalty. Kidnapping. If you've ever, when I was in Kansas City, one of the girls was grabbed and taken away and gang raped. It was a horrific situation. In Exodus chapter 21, we're back to Exodus chapter 21. We go to verse 16. It says, anyone who kidnaps someone and sells him, or if he's found in his hand, he must be put to death. Yes, death. So the Bible is pretty clear. Let's go to Deuteronomy 24:7. We were in Deuteronomy 19 before. We go to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And this really hits home because we really do periodically you'll hear of some heinous murderer being executed. Pretty rare, but it does happen. But it's incredibly rare that you find somebody who's a kidnapper that is executed. But the fact of the matter is, biblically, a person's life is never the same if they've been kidnapped. It's just never the same. And nobody gets the right to do that to somebody else. Deuteronomy 24:7, if a man is found kidnapping any of his brothers of the children of Israel, and he deals with him as a slave or sells him, then the kidnapper must die. So you must purge evil from the midst of you. And again, this is the society raising up against these heinous criminals. Now, you want to make sure you don't get the wrong guy. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. And in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6, we find out, that you've got to have good evidence. By 17:6, by the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses is the one who is to die to be put to death. By the mouth of one witness, he is not to be put to death. So you needed to have a solid case against a murderer. You needed to have a solid case. But that was a lot easier to do, frankly, in the biblical world than it is in our world, because at least in the United States of America, it's really common for people to live alone. In fact, there's a lot of times I think that young men and young women should be living with their parents and saving their money so that when they get married or when they get older, they can actually buy a house. Instead, as soon as they graduate high school or something, they go off and they never live with their parents again. But then I know people that, they've been renting for years and years and years because they've never gotten the down payment for a house together. But in the biblical world, you wanted to live with family, and women did stick very closely together in the society. They understood they were vulnerable, and even men, the same thing. So it was if somebody were to perpetrate some crime against somebody, there were usually people around that would see it. And the same thing about witnesses is repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 15. Or chapter 19, I'm sorry, verse 15. By the way, I should say that I wrote a booklet many years ago called The Death Penalty, Godly or Ungodly. And and that's on our website under resources. So and you can read it on the website, or you can just push print and print it off. So if somebody said, gosh, I wish I'd heard of the teaching, I wish I had those notes, they're all in the booklet. It's for free. It's on the website, just so you're aware of it. Now, one of the things I've done, because I was involved in prison ministry and because of contacts in the ministry, and my brother's an attorney as well, and I've talked to a number of attorneys over the years and who are Christian attorneys, and they're against the death penalty. And I every time I run into that, I've ceased being floored, but I used to just be floored by it. But I'd always say, why? Aren't you aware of what the Bible says? And I was surprised at their answer because, to be an attorney, you've got to be, natively intelligent. And so they say, yeah, we're aware of what the Bible says. And I'm, okay, so then how can you be against the death penalty if you know the Bible's for the death penalty? And the universal answer that I've gotten is, John, if you knew how often even the police lie in court and witnesses lie in court. And so people are being sent to death row or would be sent to death row who are totally innocent just because they're people who lie in court and get away with it. And the penalties in the United States for perjury are so tiny that nobody really cares about committing perjury. So the question is, how could the Bible stop this? How could the Bible assure that the court system wasn't just a bunch of kangaroo courts? And let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 19. We're in Deuteronomy 17 now. So Deuteronomy chapter 19, and we'll start in verse 16. And in verse 16 says, if a malicious witness rises up against any person to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both the people who have the dispute, who must stand before Yahweh, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days, and the judges are to make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness is a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, then you must do to him as he planned to do to his brother. In this way, you must purge evil from the midst of you. Verse 20, those who remain will hear and be afraid, and will never again commit any such evil in the midst of you. Your eyes must not pity. There is to be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, if we did this in our court system, and if somebody was lying in a capital case, and if we discovered it, and then you take the liar out and you put him to death, pretty soon people would realize really quickly, or some guy's going to get 20 years in jail, and all of a sudden this guy who's hadn't really done anything wrong, he's just going to lie in court to maybe bail his friend out, or maybe he's getting paid by somebody, or who knows what's going on. And all of a sudden he's in jail for 20 years. Well, that doesn't have to happen to too many people before you get people in court that just say, I'm not going to lie in court. If this thing falls apart and I'm discovered, I'm screwed. The guy, he did the crime, he can do the time. It's on him. So we really need to, be aware of that kind of thing. I want to do one more thing that about this that annoys. It's not that it just annoys me; it breaks my heart. Is the number of people that recklessly endanger others and then kill them, like the two college kids that were killed this week by a drunk driver, who, by the way, had been arrested on previous occasions for drunk driving, but had been let go. So this is a repeat offender drunk driver. We didn't do anything to her. We didn't, just maybe pay a fine or whatever. And here she she hit a van full of college kids, killed two of them, and injured the rest. And now all of a sudden the city's up in arms, like, how could she do this? Well, how could she not do it? She did it before and he didn't do anything. So, so let's go to Exodus chapter 21. And I think this is, we've been, like I say, we've been in Exodus before, and Exodus 21 before. In Exodus chapter 21, in verse 28, it says, if an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, yes, stoned, and its flesh must not be eaten, but the owner of the ox will not be held responsible. There are things in life that are dangerous, and you don't know they're dangerous. Now, oxen, bulls, they're dangerous. And even if you think you've got a pet bull and it's never hurt anybody before, and it's really a nice bull and it likes people and all that, that doesn't mean it can't turn and kill somebody. The same thing with a big dog. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden that dog would just become mean and kill somebody. But what God says is, look, if this is the first time and nobody knew about it, if you're around a dangerous animal and you get killed, it's on you. The animal's dangerous. You don't have to be there. If you're around a dangerous animal, it's never hurt anybody before, and but it happens to kill a person, then that's on that person. But verse 29, but if the ox had a habit of goring in the past, and its owner had been warned, but did not keep watch over it, and it has killed a man or woman, the ox must be stoned, and also its owner must be put to death. And I'll tell you, there's people that have dangerous animals that have bitten people before, attacked people before. It might be anything from a dangerous dog to whatever. If you recklessly endanger this, how I feel about drunk drivers. Drunk drivers would come under this. You recklessly endanger somebody else by your behavior, and the first time it happens, You just, well, anyway, the law's got to straighten that out. But certainly the second time you killed somebody in a car, then they would just execute you. And, we wouldn't have any drunk drivers. And I remember, I lived in Bloomington, Indiana. It's a college town. And they came on the radio and they said, look, we've set up, those traffic stops where the cops just stop every car and breathalyze them and look at them and stuff like that. And they said, like 30% after 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night, like 30% of the people you're driving, that are passing you on a 2-lane road are impaired in some way. They've either drank too much, or they've been smoking weed, or they stayed up all night Thursday night studying for Friday exams. And so now they're on the road, but they haven't slept in 20 hours. There are all kinds of different ways of being impaired. But, basically they said, if we lived out in the country in Bloomington, and my wife and I we just stayed home. It's Friday night to Saturday night. It's real simple. If we wanted to be over at somebody else's house, we went early and we spent the night. If we wanted, to get out ourselves, we get out early and pick up beer or whatever it was we wanted to drink and snacks, or invite anybody over or whatever, and then we were home because it was just too big a risk. There were too many car accidents. Just a risk we wouldn't want to take. Well, that's a risk we shouldn't have to worry about. If people were concerned that they had caused problems before and now they were going to get in real trouble for it. So anyway, I wanted to just to do this teaching by way of broaching the subject, and just setting it out in front of us that here's what God is directing us to do to keep our society safe. I know that there are people that have been, kind of lobbying for a death penalty for a long time and haven't gotten very far. And will things change between now and the time the Lord comes back? I don't know, but we always keep praying. And in the meantime, we pray for the safety of each other, pray for the safety of people on the roads, pray for people to be smarter and wiser, and that we can protect people's lives and keep them from being hurt or killed. So anyway, this is some of what God says about the death penalty, and I'm sure there's plenty of room for discussion. And there's a lot more in the booklet that I wrote, because there's other things to consider, like some of the things that require a death penalty in the Old Testament, we wouldn't have a death penalty for now, and there's various reasons for that in God's economy. So all that stuff can be talked out at some level. But it's been a joy to share this with you, and I trust you've enjoyed it and been blessed by it too.